Hello, friends. So today I want to address something that directly or indirectly affects all of us and society at large. And that is the fact that as lifespan expands, which it is doing right now, the fastest growing demographic is that of people in their later ages, even over 100. And that brings up a big concern because as lifespan expands, there's concern that there will be more people with dementia, Alzheimer's, burnt out caregivers, on and on. There's a lot of progress being made on the treatment of and prevention of Alzheimer's, particularly the prevention, because not all genes that predispose you to Alzheimer's or dementia are penetrating in 100% way, which means they don't guarantee the disease. But today I want to argue about an approach to dementia and Alzheimer's that is based on a yogic and Vedāntic and non-dual perspective. So from the yogic perspective, it can be argued that dementia and Alzheimer's are basically samskaras, or the expression of samskaras, latent impressions, and that these remain active, and that some of what we see as symptoms may actually be the more naked, unfiltered play of these impressions, samskara and vasana. So I'm going to frame this in terms of classical yogic psychology, and then I'll do my best to link it to what we know about dementia, while keeping clear that this is a contemplative model and not necessarily 100% neuroscientific claim. So in classic yoga and Vedanta, the mind is a layered, subtle instrument, antakarana, composed of manas, which is sensory mind, attention, buddhi, discriminative intelligence, ahamkara, I, sense or ego, and chitta, storehouse of impressions. Samskaras are the latent tendencies and memory traces stored in chitta, giving rise to vasana, habitual urges, and coloring perception and behavior. They are more like deep pattern attractors than specific explicit memories. So from this standpoint, what we call gross brain and cognitive function are vehicles through which samskaras express. They're not the source of samskaras. What we ordinarily call personality or habits, even character, is the dynamic play of samskaras and vasanas through these instruments. So when the gross vehicle is damaged or deteriorating, the deep patterns are not necessarily gone, rather their way of expression changes. So in the non-dual and yogic discourse, one often uses the filter or lens metaphor for the brain and nervous system. Consciousness is primary. The brain is a limiter and organizer of how that consciousness appears as a personal mind. So from within that metaphor, dementia could be seen as a progressive breakdown of the filtering, organizing function of manas and buddhi as they depend on neural integrity. When the discriminative and inhibitory functions weaken, underlying samskaras may become more rawly expressed, less inhibited by social conditioning and what is called executive control. Hence, traits that were previously managed or sublimated, like anger, fear, possessiveness, clinging, or even childlike joy and affection, may become more obvious. This dovetails with common clinical observations. Individuals with dementia often show exaggerated versions of prior traits. A previously anxious person becoming more fearful and repetitive. A previously controlling person becoming more suspicious or rigid. From a yogic lens, this looks like long-standing vasanas expressing with fewer breaks. Hence, a distinction is helpful. Episodic semantic memory, names, events, dates, depends heavily on hippocampal and cortical integrity and is obviously impaired in Alzheimer's type pathology. Samskaric memory is more like a deep preconceptual patterning of the subtle body. In yogic terms, it is not reducible to hippocampal traces and is carried by the pranic and causal levels, sukshma and karan sharir. So sukshma sharir is the subtle body, karan sharir, think of it as a quantum body or qualia body. Therefore, in a yogic framing, loss of explicit recall does not imply erasure of samskaras. The person may not remember, so-called remember, a spouse's name, yet still respond with tenderness, irritation, or dependence conditioned by decades of shared samskaras. Even when language deteriorates, one sees patterned responses to touch, music, mantras, devotional images, or familiar rituals. That persistence of affective and behavioral pattern aligns more with the idea of enduring samskaras than with purely cortical memory. Empirically, practices like mantra, kirtan, and simple yogic meditative routines have been found to modulate mood, stress, and certain cognitive functions in older adults and those at risk of dementia, suggesting that deep affective networks remain available even when explicit cognition is compromised. From a yogic non-dual perspective, it is quite coherent to say, as cortical inhibition, social conditioning, and cognitive editing loosen, the underlying vasanas play out more transparently. Behaviors that appear inappropriate, impulsive, or regressive can be seen as unmasked patterns that were always present but previously constrained. The person's energy may oscillate between different samskaric groups: fear, clinging, anger, sweetness, without the usual narrative coherence. We are watching the raw patterning without the story that used to stitch it into what we call the self. In that sense, yes, one could argue that dementia makes the samskaras more obvious because the sophisticated ego structure that once concealed, rationalized, or redirected them is weakened. From a non-dual standpoint, both Advaita and Kashmir Shaivism, pure awareness, Chit, Prakash, remains untouched by dementia. It neither ages nor deteriorates. The jiva's subtle configuration, samskaras, vasanas, continues to operate until dissolved by insight, grace, or exhaustion through experience. Dementia affects the manifest configuration, the way that awareness identifies with and operates through a particular set of mental instruments. This allows a subtle reframe. What is broken is not awareness, but the particular interface by which awareness once enacted a coherent autobiographical sense. What is on display are fragments of jiva's patterning, now decoupled from the narrative continuity that made them appear as one consistent person. In contemplative work with such individuals, one might emphasize meeting the underlying awareness directly through presence, touch, tone, and simple shared silence. 2. Recognizing that behind the fragmented expression, the same unconditioned consciousness is shining. And 3. Allowing the visible samskaras, however difficult, to be seen as impersonal movements in Shakti, not as the essence of being. This has practical implications. If one accepts this perspective, certain practical attributes follow. Compassionate witnessing. Caregivers and practitioners can relate to the person as awareness plus samskaras rather than a ruined self, which softens despair and personalizes less. Mantra and bhakti. Even simple mantra, kirtan, or devotional cues can engage deep samskaras of trust, love, and surrender, often more effectively than rational conversation. 3. Subtle yoga, gentle movement, breath, and relaxation practices designed for dementia patients help reduce agitation and improve mood, suggesting that prana-based interventions still reach the system even when cognition is impaired. And then finally here, karmic perspective. If one uses that lens, the unfolding of dementia can be seen as part of the exhaustion or ripening of certain karmic patterns, not as cosmic punishment, but as one more modality by which samskaras run their course. Karmic destiny running its course. One can, of course, misuse this framing to spiritualize away the very real suffering and clinical needs involved. The yogic view is best held alongside rigorous medical and psychological care, not instead of it. So I hope this is helpful for both people who have people in their lives who are struggling with dementia or who are filled with fear about their own possible dementia as they grow older, and also for caretakers. Namaste. Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma Tattvamasi Aham Brahmasmi Satchitananda.